an amazingly large aircraft. I can see why it was the heaviest single-engine aircraft of the Second World War. Crikey, in the cockpit, I can see what they meant when they said how spacious it was, because I can slide into this. It's like, it's a cushioned seat. It's superb. This aircraft is one of the treasures of naval aviation history. The Grumman Avenger, the heaviest single-engined aircraft of World War II.
You were in charge of seeing that it was maintained and keeping it fuel, keeping it ready to fly. And your job was to see that it was always ready to fly. And if it wasn't, that's the reason it was turned in, so they'd know.
In the centuries since powered flight began, thousands of models of aircraft have come and gone. All but a handful of historic planes have been consigned to the scrap heap or the museum gallery. But there exists a core of devoted enthusiasts keeping the world's greatest aircraft operational and often still flying. These are the stories of those machines and those people making history come alive. Each one a plane resurrection.
British Fleet Air Arm pilot Ian Patterson said of the Avenger, after having flown the old biplanes, the Swordfish, that getting into this cockpit was like, it made you feel like Lord of the Manor, because there is so much room in here. He said you sat down in this seat and it was like being in the boss's chair in the office, because you had space. You even had a urine receptacle in the aircraft. A 2600 engine up there, huge. What was it? Well, it was a torpedo bomber, the Grumman Avenger, but known to many of those that flew it as the Turkey, simply because of how it looked, not necessarily how it flew. It flew actually very well indeed. Kevin, you've actually flown this aircraft.
Yes, I have.
What's it like to fly?
It's pretty awesome, actually.
Does it handle well?
It does. It's a bit heavy on the controls, but very stable. Very stable airplane.
The Avenger was originally produced by Grumman, but they needed the capacity for the F6, and Grumman manufacturing then was taken up by General Motors, who produced most of the 10,000 or so of these aircraft built. And one of the ways they actually helped the motor company to get started was they supplied a sort of a kit version of the Avenger to help get manufacturing started as quickly as possible.
In the late 1930s, the American military, notably the Navy, were not equipping for a fast-evolving global war. The Navy were prepared more for defending their own coast against capital battleships and submarines. The US Navy introduced the Douglas Devastator in 1935, at which time it was state-of-the-art. However, with the rise of Nazi Germany and the vast extension of the German U-boat fleet, that model, like many others, was obsolete by the time hostilities started in 1939. Grumman rapidly developed what became the new TBF Avenger, a monstrously large single-engine aircraft that could conventionally bomb, dive bomb, torpedo and depth charge, and was well equipped to defend itself. Its bulbous fuselage not only featured a substantial bomb bay, but also capacity for additional crew members tucked below the defensive turret. The prototype of the Avenger, penned by Leroy Grumman, first flew on the 7th of August 1941. Two prototypes were ordered by the Navy, categorized as the XTBF-1. However, one of the initial test aircraft was lost early in the program, causing concerns that Grumman may not be able to get the type operational as quickly as the military required. Grumman rose to the task though, and the type entered service powered by the 1700 horsepower Wright R2600 its 2 rows of 14 cylinders giving the aircraft impressive performance relative to its size and somewhat ungainly design. In what would be a sinister portent of what was to come, the public were invited to the Grumman plant in late 1941 to see the new aircraft. Grumman threw their doors open on the 7th of December, and, as the impressed locals viewed the Avenger, the Japanese fleet were wreaking havoc at Pearl Harbor. By the end of that unveiling day, the Grumman plant at Bethpage, New York, was in high-security lockdown, a fear of sabotage, and America was heading for war.
The TBF, a single-engine, 3-place folding mid-wing monoplane equipped for use as a torpedo plane, as a horizontal or glide bomber with a capacity of 4 500-pound bombs, and as a scout or smoke layer. The TBF is designed to take off from or land on a carrier and can be launched by catapult.
Sadly, few of the veterans who served with the Avenger remain to tell their stories. However, the aircraft, due in no small part to its ruggedness and adaptability in civilian service, is, in warbird terms, relatively abundant. With many on static display and more than a dozen flying examples in the USA alone, there's a chance for the descendants of those who knew the Avenger at war to come and reconnect with their family aviation heritage.
I'm Donald Matthew Ball, and relevancy to this is my father was a test pilot during World War II for Grumman out of Bethpage. So the cockpit is his office, and so he would go in for the briefing for the day, get his schedule of what planes he was going to test, and then go fly them. He had to do all the maneuvers that a fighter pilot would have to go through. So they stressed it to the max. They would do rolls, they would do loops, evasive maneuvers, just to make sure everything was reacting the way it was supposed to for the fighter pilot.
Did he ever have to bail out of an aircraft?
He never had to, so he was very lucky there, very careful. He's always been he was always a very cautious pilot. I know that there was one accident that he had a neck injury, and he was one of the first that were given penicillin.
Subsequent research has shown that Donald's father was a remarkable man in more ways than one. He was a noted test pilot as aircraft came off the line, a very hazardous occupation. But following his crash, and after suffering a serious wound infection, he was literally one in several million. He was selected to receive the then experimental first batches of penicillin, manufactured after Alexander Fleming's breakthrough discovery by American company Merck & Co. He was probably saved by virtue of the fact that he was treated in a hospital local to the Grumman plant and within the catchment area of Merck's clinical trial, making him a true survivor.
Medical science today owes much to one of the great scientific achievements of recent times, the discovery of penicillin, a wonder drug now saving thousands of lives.
He was very close to death. The doctors were at their end point of being able to treat him, and they said, okay, well, penicillin is the brand new drug to come out and cure infections. So they said, well, he's either going to live or he may not. So they gave him the penicillin, and lo and behold, he lived and had 6 children and married a wonderful wife, my mother, Doris Ball.
Early tests had shown that whilst the Avenger was capable and stable, it could also bite back, especially at takeoff, and US pilots were briefed accordingly.
You will trim the airplane the same way, except you'll have 1 notch nose down. Pilot builds his speed up to about 60 knots, and down come his flaps. They operate very quickly and give an immediate lift. It is not safe to bring up the wing flaps until you have a good margin of speed at an altitude of 300 to 500 feet.
the Americans were quick to adapt to the need to provide fighter and torpedo bomber cover to convoys being stalked by submarines, and conceived the escort carrier, essentially a variety of smaller conventional ships adapted to have a simple flat-top flight deck structure from which missions could be launched. The concept proved sound, and for smaller, light fighters, the deck, though short, was just about adequate for launch and recovery in normal conditions. Accidents on takeoff, though, were common, and many Avengers were damaged or lost on or around their home carriers without the intervention of the enemy. To allow the heavier fighters and aircraft like the Avenger to fly from the smaller carrier, a delicate choreography was needed between the ship and the aircraft to optimize landing, but in particular takeoffs. What was needed was a device that could boost takeoff performance in much the same way as a catapult, but without the machinery of a major carrier. The answer, quickly fitted to the Avenger, was JATO, Jet Assisted Takeoff.
The Navy demonstrates a jet unit which permits carrier-based aircraft to take off in less space or with heavier loads than normally required. An engine in itself, each cylinder is full of a solid propellant which includes oxygen in the mixture so it can burn without air. It has an electrically controlled spark plug which sets it off, and a rocket-like vent through which the jet gases pass to give their thrust, as the Navy calls them, allow 33 to 60% reduction in takeoff run, or a great increase in load. Once airborne, the JATO unit is jettisoned. A carrier plane takes off, relying solely on propeller thrust. Now, a jet-assisted takeoff. Beside aiding carrier takeoffs, the device allows more deck space for extra planes.
The Avenger saw its first action in the Battle of Midway, a huge engagement designed by the Japanese as a trap for the US Navy, in order to finish off the work of Pearl Harbor and crush the Americans as a force in the Pacific. The States, however, had broken the Japanese cipher, anticipated the ruse, and planned their own surprise attack. It was to this naval warfare that 6 new Avengers were dispatched. As the engagement began, it soon became clear that the development of the Avenger had come not a moment too soon, as its predecessors in the fleet were wiped out by Japanese aerial and anti-aircraft gunnery. 15 of 16 Douglas Devastators pressed into action were downed in one fell swoop, and, alarmingly, the Avenger fared little better, losing 5 of the 6 debutant aircraft. The concern amongst naval aviators was to discover whether this was inevitable attrition with crews early in their learning curve, or a fundamental fault with the design under combat conditions. The sole survivor, heavily damaged, was immediately shipped back to the USA for evaluation, but, as events would show, the Avenger was more than up to the job.
The Avenger prototype saw service in a different manner as well, not in the skies, but actually being put by the NACA in a full-scale wind tunnel to test for hinge movements and flutter. And of course that organisation later became NASA. And it's ironic to think that the designers of the Avenger would be involved in a very, very minor way in what went on to space development. And in the tests that they did under the NACA, they even tested the Avenger for a Mach number reading. I don't think it ever went that fast.
As America battled to play catch-up in military technology, the work of the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which had been formed way back in 1915, became vital. Their development of aerodynamic drag-reducing ducts, airfoil sections and streamlining speeded development of many later war models. The organization also invested heavily in understanding the effects of increasingly large propellers, like that of the Avenger, on the wake aerodynamics of the aircraft. The Avenger was chosen for wind tunnel testing in order to assist the company after the loss of the second prototype, and to many people's surprise, despite its distinctly portly profile, it proved itself to be relatively slippery.
On my left, the Avenger. On my right, the Wildcat. And these aircraft teamed up to become a formidable duo in combat on what were then called escort carriers. They were small carriers, about half the size of the main fleet carriers, and their job was to provide particularly convoy protection. And what you would have there against U-boats, you would have the Avenger, and then to protect the escort carrier you would have the Wildcat, and they were very successful as a combination of aircraft. Perhaps particularly successful in one of the more famous incidents of the Second World War, when an Avenger sank the Japanese submarine I-52. And the story of this is one of changing and improving technology on both sides. The Japanese had developed these massive cargo submarines to travel from Japan to Germany for supplies of essential materials. And on board the I-52, there was material there that would be capable of producing what we would today call a weapon of mass destruction, a dirty bomb. The I-52 was coming to Germany. She had on board some 2.2 tons of gold, which would be payment for previous materials. But technology went on both sides. The British had Ultra. We were listening to the I-52. We were even tracking it as it sailed towards Europe. We knew that it rendezvoused for refueling, and we were closing in the USS Bogue, an escort carrier with Avengers on board. Equipped also with a new secret torpedo called Fido. Also equipped with another development, sonobuoys. And in the darkness, in June 1944, Avengers took off to hunt for the I-52.
The Japanese military invested hugely in submarine technology before and during World War II. Whilst the Germans perfected the sleek hunter-killer U-boats, the Japanese had things planned on a far grander scale. Their concept was to build battleships and cargo vessels, even an aircraft carrier that hid beneath the waves. The I-52 was one of the stars of the submerged fleet. Massive, fast and spacious by submarine standards, it was tasked with running between Germany and Japan, expediting many of the technology for cash exchanges between the Axis countries. At the time, it was the largest submarine ever built, but that did little to protect it against the latest technology from the US Navy, the sonobuoy, a sensitive hydrophone dropped to float in the ocean and transmit back to its host aircraft the sounds of passing submarines. The Avengers stalking the I-52 were backing that up with a deadly new weapon.
As one of the most successful naval attack aircraft of the Second World War, amongst the weaponry carried in the Avenger was the Mark 24 mine, which wasn't actually a mine at all. It was the first acoustic torpedo developed by the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory. On board one of the Avengers was Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor, with Ed Whitlock as his radar sonobuoy operator. And they got a blip. Fate then helped. They had only half of the radar screen working, but unfortunately for the I-52, Whitlock picked up a signal. The Avenger swung round and dropped one of the new sonobuoys. As it splashed into the water, they listened intently, and then came the sound of a submarine underwater. This new technology was helping, and adding now to the development of the technology was another piece of acoustic equipment called Fido, and it was a torpedo tucked into the Avenger. The torpedo was then dropped, and it would hunt and seek out by sound the I-52. And then the crew could hear the sound of an explosion. Unsure of their success against the I-52, another Avenger was ordered into action, piloted by Lieutenant William Flash Gordon, with Ed Price, a civilian technologist, on board. They went in also dropping another sonar buoy and further acoustic torpedo. The explosion from under the water told the crew that they had had success. Later, wreckage was found, rubber floating to the surface, and grimly, even human flesh. They knew then that the I-52 had gone to the bottom. Decades after the war, in the late 1990s, the Golden Submarine was found 17,000 feet down. And there would have been attempts to raise the gold at least, but the Japanese government regarded that as a war grave.
And so the I-52 lies at the ocean bottom, an underwater war grave concealing a mystery cargo, and in its perfect preservation, a reminder of the deadly power of the Grumman Avenger.
The Kavanagh's example, a TBM-3E, was actually manufactured in 1944 during the Second World War and was destined to serve on escort carriers. These were small carriers primarily escorting convoys in the Pacific and the Atlantic. And the Avenger was one of the aircraft ideally suited with its landing and takeoff capabilities from a smaller carrier that made it a prime example for use in that role. For their Avenger, the Cavanagh Flight Museum have chosen the markings used by an Avenger that served on the escort carrier USS Cape Gloucester, one of those that was in the Pacific trying to protect convoys and protect the main battle fleet against Japanese kamikaze attacks. The Avenger also has another claim to fame, courtesy of Rose Hicker, Rosie the Riveter, who achieved a record in manufacturing by the number of rivets she actually inserted on one shift. And she's immortal now in the sense that Norman Rockwell created a wartime image of Rosie that has now signified the steadfastness, the determination and the hard work of the people that manufactured aircraft like the Avenger. There's room each side, plenty of space. Of course, having now got into it, the challenge is the reverse, getting out of it and down that enormous wing, out of the cockpit, and then carefully down the wing.
The Avenger was enthusiastically welcomed by the British Navy. At the time, they were operating the ancient Swordfish biplane as their primary torpedo delivery aircraft. The Swordfish was archaic by the time the Second World War started, but nonetheless was without a successful replacement, so soldiered on, scoring notable successes against the odds, including the damaging of the Bismarck, leading to its eventual sinking. The Avenger, or as it was originally called in fleet air arm use, the Tarpon, came into operation in 1943 and transformed the fortunes of the British carrier pilots by virtue of the fact that it was fast, heavily armed, and importantly had a fully enclosed and heated cockpit. The Avenger proved as capable in the UK as it did in US hands. 3 were even experimentally modified to carry the high-ball bouncing bomb, although this proved unsuccessful. The addition of radar made it a formidable weapon, and after the war the Royal Navy took delivery of a further 100 aircraft. The most astonishing action by the Avenger in British hands, though, has little to do with naval deployment and everything to do with Germany's wonder weapons. On the 9th of July 1944, a Royal Naval Avenger was returning from patrol when the turret gunner, leading aircraftman Fred Schirmer, spotted a V-1 flying bomb travelling fully 150 miles per hour faster than the Grumman and about to overtake them. He loosed off just over 20 rounds at the device from 700 yards and, incredibly, downed it. For this achievement, Schirmer was mentioned in dispatches. In fact, he wasn't the last person to achieve this. Legend has it that a second doodlebug was destroyed by a long-forgotten Avenger crew later in the war.
Within the bowels of the Avenger, there were 2 crewmen, one here, behind the pilot, another down there, a gun turret up above there, a ventral gun down below. The problem they faced was there was no access for the crewman in the back to get to the cockpit. That's beyond the bulkhead up in front. In the event of the Avenger being hit, the 2 crewmen in the back faced a dreadful situation. If the pilot were killed or incapacitated, they had no access to the cockpit. Their only alternative was to bail out or face a watery grave. This is the radio operator's position?
Radio operator, yes, was back here.
Yeah, and if you were carrying, say, sonar buoys or the acoustic torpedo, the bomb bay is down under us here.
Yeah, that is correct. This window looks actually into the bomb bay.
I see, and behind us then is a ventral position for the gunner?
In some TBMs or TBFs, there was a ventral gun. In this model, there was not.
Okay. We've got a fixed forward firing gun for the pilot.
Yes.
I understand. And then we've got a 30 caliber gun up here for
50.
the 50 caliber gun. A 50 caliber gun, a bit more poke in it then. This is a rotating turret, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so it's not a fixed position, you're swinging the turret round. Would that affect the stability of the aircraft?
Yes, it does.
It does?
Yes.
So it's not used now, I take it?
It is operable. It is... in wartime, they actually had electric motors that drove it. Right now, we don't have the electric motors hooked up, but the mechanical drive is hooked up.
Yeah. So it could actually then be swung around while the aircraft's in flight.
Yes. It's like somebody stepping on a rudder for the pilot. He would feel, because it would deflect the aircraft.
I see. So you would have to then be using your rudder to compensate for the swing of the turret at the back. Mm-hmm. And if you think of that, I suppose, with that turret moving quickly in combat situations, I can get a feel for how that must have been. Mm-hmm. Here is Kevin to help by showing us the access, or otherwise, to the gunner's position. I've got my hand on a chunk of armour plating, and once Kevin is in there, our temporary gunner, he will then pull this up because it provides a modicum of protection for the gunner. But you can see in the aircraft how difficult it would be to bail out of this plane in a hurry. With a crew of 3, the Avenger had armament, a fixed 30.30 forward-firing machine gun in the nose. In the turret, there was a 50 caliber machine gun carrying a bit more punch. And to protect in the ever vulnerable part of the aircraft underneath the tail was a ventral .30 machine gun as well. So the Avenger would be capable of delivering and defending itself under attack.
The Avenger has always been a popular aircraft with the public, but the chunky Grumman also found its place in folklore after a baffling incident off the Florida Keys.
The Avenger has an air of mystery around it because one of the things that it is associated with is the strange story of the Bermuda Triangle. Flight 19, December 1945, disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle, and it's one of those enduring, as yet unresolved aviation mysteries. The Avenger's that disappeared that day have not been found, but may one day be found. For now, somewhere on the seabed rest 5 Grumman Avenger aircraft, and if discovered, they will feature significantly in aviation history because of the circumstances of their disappearance.
The missing aircraft of Flight 19 were found, but only in fiction. The planes featured as a pivotal plotline in Steven Spielberg's UFO epic Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Surviving TBMs were gathered to represent Flight 19, returned intact by unknown aliens and left in the Mexican outback. The film did feature a delightful start-up sequence and respectfully changed the names of the pilots when they emerged, confused, from the mothership. The reality is that the greatest likelihood for the real-life loss was spatial disorientation. The aircraft lead ship with defective compasses, flying in the wrong direction in decreasing light, and the whole flight eventually ditching far into the unforgiving Atlantic. The cruel reality is that training flight accidents, although not normally on this scale, were common between 1942 and 1945 and accounted for the loss of 95 aviation personnel from Flight 19's base, the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale. Life on an aircraft carrier in World War II might have seemed to have a degree of glamour alongside the brutal reality of war and the risk to life every day, but it was no easy posting. Many films and photographs depict the war in the Pacific, indeed the war on the Pacific, as being set against a backdrop of blue skies. That, however, certainly wasn't always the case. Tropical storms could be devastating, and on the open decks of a carrier, there was literally nowhere to hide. Unlike a conventional ship where you could pretty well guarantee that the majority of items were firmly bolted down, the risk of aircraft, bombs, or torpedoes breaking loose during storms and rough seas was ever present. Carriers also proved a first-choice target for suicide bombers, the Japanese Divine Wind or kamikaze missions. With their easy-to-spot decks, largely made of wood which would burn ferociously, the end of the Pacific War proved nightmarish for these ships under attack by pilots determined to perish as part of their mission. Even in normal operations, an Avenger crew chief was working between moving armed aircraft with the inherent risks that brings.
Well, they were called plane captains because you were in charge of seeing that it was maintained and keeping it fuel, keeping it ready to fly. And your job was to see that it was always ready to fly. And if it wasn't, that's the reason it was turned in. It was the best aircraft made. It was just dependable. I mean, if it run, it'd fly. And it was always loaded when you took off with a ship. If it was loaded, it usually slunk down. And you'd see it come up way out there. But it used to be so heavy, it would lose altitude when it left the end of the ship. They had crews that put torpedoes on them. They had one torpedo fit up in the belly.
Yeah.
And they're pretty big and heavy. It carried, I can't remember, it was 4 or 6 50 caliber guns in the wings. Man, it's been many years. It's either 4 or 6 bomb racks. They could carry bombs.
One of the claims to fame by the Avenger, and there were many, is that the aircraft was flown by George H.W. Bush, a future president of the United States. And history may have been changed had he not bailed out of his Avenger near the island of Chichijima and been rescued by the American submarine Finback. His crew members were less fortunate, and those that did have the misfortune to fall into Japanese hands, the treatment was barbaric on many occasions. Beheadings were carried out, and in some really ghastly cases, cannibalism occurred on the remains of executed United States naval airmen.
Bush was the only survivor of the 9 downed flyers. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding the fate of Bush Sr.'s colleagues showed that they had been unlawfully killed after they were captured, and the allegations of ritual cannibalism were most likely true, a gruesome reality that stayed with the president in later life. The airmen were killed on the orders of Lieutenant General Yoshi Tachibana. An American War Crimes Tribunal tried him in August 1946 in relation to the execution of U.S. Navy airmen during August 1944. He was found guilty of murder and prevention of honorable burial. Tachibana was sentenced to death and hanged. By the time George H.W. Bush left operations in the Navy after the bombing of Hiroshima, the future president had flown 58 missions, completed 128 carrier landings, and recorded 1,228 hours of flight time. He remained in the reserve until 1955, and in his later years as the Commander-in-Chief was close to the Navy. Whenever the opportunity arose, George Bush would reunite with surviving examples of the TBM he flew and loved as a 20-year-old, with his own machine even immortalized in model form.
Wartime aircraft, of course, would be used in many tests and trials, and the Avenger was used in what was called counter-illumination camouflage. And they fitted Yehudi lights to this thing, so the lights came on and they automatically adjusted to the brightness of the sky that the aircraft was flying in. That way it could approach, creep up if you like, on a target and would be concealed from observers on the ship because it simply matched the surrounding light of the sky and didn't appear as a dark shape in the heavens coming towards them. How successful this was, of course, is a matter of some debate. There are many stories represented by the Avenger, courage and tragedy, and perhaps none more so than the story of a young gunner on the USS Essex. Such were the circumstances, it was felt that they would bury the young gunner at sea. Accordingly, the crew were mustered on the deck, and in a final tribute to their comrade, the complete Avenger with the young gunner inside was buried at sea.
That gunner, Lois Dean, was just 23 when he perished, having enlisted in 1942 and been posted to the USS Essex, joining her VT-15 torpedo outfit and flying the Avenger, in which he was laid to rest. Dean's aircraft will never be disturbed, but many Avengers, from which the crew thankfully escaped, or which were disposed of as irreparable, are scattered in lagoons and atolls across the Pacific. These have become, ironically, peaceful monuments in clear blue seas. As the war drew on, with the pre-atomic bomb presumption that the Pacific conflict could last until at least 1947, new, deadly torpedo developments were needed to ensure the Japanese fleet could be subdued in what looked likely to be a future war of attrition. The Avenger proved to be the ideal platform for this research, given her speed at sea level and huge carrying capacity.
If you want to fill them with air, bomb them. If you want to fill them with water, torpedo them. The standard question of every torpedo pilot has always been, when do we get a torpedo that can be launched from high altitudes and great speed? The answer is that we have such a torpedo now. And here it is, launched at 260 knots and 800 feet. What's more, it's running hot, straight, and normal. All torpedoes of the Mark 13 Mod 6, 7, 8, and 9 type look pretty much like the older models. So what has revolutionized the performance of the torpedo? The shroud ring, commonly called the ringtail, Mark 1 Model 0, in conjunction with a drag ring on the nose of the torpedo, does the trick. This is a steel ring welded to guide vanes of the new torpedo. Using this ringtail with a nose drag ring and wooden stabilizer, successful test drops have been made at 2,000 feet with a speed of 350 knots. Optimum performance is obtained at about 800 feet and 260 knots.
When speaking of aircraft like the Grumman Avenger, we remember the sacrifice of so many airmen killed in combat. Those who died at sea, those whose remains were recovered and they were subsequently buried. We have to think now, over the passage of time, to the debt that we actually owe the generation that fought with the Allies for the freedom that we actually enjoy today, including the crews of the Avenger aircraft. And one of the most poignant experiences at the Cavanagh Flight Museum was meeting a veteran from World War II who was making a pilgrimage to see his aircraft, the Grumman Avenger. And as he was wheeled in his wheelchair towards this dark blue symbol, in a sense, symbol of the young man that he once was. But there was youth that embodied him as he got closer to this aircraft.
There she is. After all of these years.
Fingerprints on it.
That's all right. They are fingerprints that deserve to be there.
And that youth in his old frame became apparent as he stood, at first unsteadily, from the wheelchair to lean against the propeller of that Grumman Avenger. And one couldn't even begin to think of what was going through his mind, only perhaps that the years were cascading away to the young sailor who had once upon a time stood on the deck of a carrier to have a photograph taken very much like this elderly gentleman, a veteran from the Second World War, and his Grumman Avenger. And I remembered then, as we said goodbye, knowing there were not that many years, if any, ahead for him. But the Avenger will stand in tribute to him for generations to come. We owe the fact that so many Avengers survive flying and in museums today, to the fact that the aircraft found another lease of life post-war as a firefighter equipped with retardants operating in Canada and in the United States on the vital task of preventing the spread of forest fires in that part of the world.
The Avenger, although an expensive aircraft in itself, was of little more than scrap value when the war ended, its place taken by jet and turboprop aircraft, missiles and new, advanced ship-launched munitions. It was, however, a lot of aircraft for very little money on the civilian market. Unlike C-47s, which quickly converted to their domestic airliner role, or P-51 Mustangs, which made executive transports, or high-adrenaline air racers, the TBM didn't really find a good fit in Civvy Street until aerial firefighters started to acquire the type. Her vast bomb bay, rugged field performance and reputation for pinpoint accuracy made her the aircraft of choice in forest firefighting, but as this rare footage from 1970s California shows, flying the Avenger was still not without its risks, sometimes fatal. Shortly after the drop by this tanker over Placerville, the aircraft turned to observe its effect, clipped the trees on rising ground, and immediately there was no return, the pilot tragically perishing in his Avenger. The Avenger then lives on, thankfully with a good number of flying examples still in the sky, saluting those aircraft and crews who served. Such are the number still airworthy that in 2018 a gathering of turkeys was arranged in Peru, Illinois, which was captured at the time by the lens of Ryan Sondheimer in spectacular fashion, a fitting tribute to the long-lived TBM.